Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. A very warm welcome to this month's episode of our Keys webinar. We're so pleased to have you with us for today's session. What we're trying to do in these webinars is each month bring you an update on how people around the world are feeling and adapting to today's changing dynamic, but each time take a topic and really think about it from some new and different angles. And this time, we thought it was a good moment to think about a topic which it's easy to generalize about, Generation Z, Millennials, but difficult perhaps to really get further unless we go and think about some of the details, some of the dynamics, and some of the context in which people are living their lives these days. So to help us to do that, we will have Daryl, who's in Copenhagen today, who's going to kick us off and help us think about this topic with our eyes wide open. We're then going to go to India, where Ashwini in Delhi is going to help us think through how a new generation of people in India is living their lives these days. And then we are going to go to a country with a rather older population, which is Italy, and Chiara in Milan is going to give us perspectives on how that country is adapting. All of the resources will be available after the webinar, and you'll be able to download or even watch the video again if you'd like to. So to kick off though, I've been looking at the public mood out there. This was the month where it's been World Mental Health Day, of course, and I've tried to bring a little bit of an how are things theme to this opening overview of the latest research that we've been carrying out with people in different countries. Now, of course, it's not quite the end of the year, but we are in day 291, and I thought it might be a good moment just to think about what's changed since the start of the year. And one way we've been doing that, actually since the start of the pandemic, is via a study we do called Ipsos Essentials, where we try and accompany people and get them to really tell us how they're feeling at different stages of their journey. We started in the COVID crisis and we've carried on all the way through. And when we started, we developed a question which we found has been a very good reference point because it gives us people's self-assessments of how they feel right now in their context, in their lives. On the left-hand side, no pandemic, no worries. On the right-hand side, new normal, post-pandemic. I'm kind of living my life as I used to do before coronavirus. And the theory was, when we started this, was we were perhaps expecting it to be a linear journey as people went through different stages. Now, as we all know on the call, it wasn't quite so linear. There's been many zigzags and some U-turns along the way. And even now, it's quite a complex picture. We certainly, however, do now have, as we look towards the end of the year, more people are saying they are approaching some kind of new normal or putting the pandemic behind them. It's certainly at a higher level than, of course, it was earlier in the year, but it's still quite a varied picture. And it's a particularly varied picture when we look at things by country. And this you'll see as a recurrent theme in our webinar today, looking at that context on the ground. On the right-hand side of the chart, we have a number of countries from Asia, which I think are quite cautious about saying they're in a new normal experience. But on the left-hand side, I wanted to look in 3 countries in particular: US, United Kingdom, and South Africa. Now, these are among the countries who are most likely to say that they're in a kind of new normal or post-pandemic period. But that's not to say that everything looks fine in those countries. Remember, this question is asking them specifically about the COVID pandemic. Now, the health dynamics of that may be receding, but other dynamics are certainly in play. And one of the markers, I think, for today is that those 3 countries, which may be less worried about the health aspects, are among the top countries saying that they feel things are out of control in their nation right now. My own country, the United Kingdom, is making a strong bid for top spot on that measure at the moment. We'll hear from Italy and India in a moment. There are 2 countries which are also a little bit more than average, saying that they feel that things are not perhaps in equilibrium. Now, just to pick up on that country angle a little bit more, One of the studies that we look at every month in these webinars is our What Worries the World study, because it tracks this sense of what people are worried about in their own particular country, in their own particular part of the year. Now, one of the big themes of this year, of course, has been the rise of inflation. 20% of people said it was one of the big issues facing their country in January of this year. It's now 40%. But even there, a global phenomenon on one level has many different stories, and that's illustrated in this chart. It depends, of course, on the economy. It will depend on the country's recent economic history, and it depends on the whole infrastructure of that particular market. So even on something like inflation, we need to be careful and think about the immediate context. Geography is another component when we're thinking about people's immediate context, their own mental maps. This is the question which I've highlighted, which is the number of people who say military conflict between nations is one of the big things that they're concerned about. Poland and Germany, two of the countries closest, of course, to the war in Ukraine geographically, are the ones who are most worried on that measure. And thinking still more about how we feel, we have been doing some work specifically to coincide with World Mental Health Day. And I wanted to share with you just 3 key findings from that study, which we released earlier this month. I think the first is that this is a topic where the country differences are a little bit less apparent. 76% saying that mental health and physical health are equally important. 30 out of 34 countries have more than 7 in 10 people agreeing with that statement. And so it's as near as we ever get to being a consensus internationally. But rather fewer say that their own healthcare systems treat mental and physical health equally, and there's a much stronger sense that it's the physical health that gets the bigger priority in their health system. The final thing to say is that I think people are much clearer, perhaps, than they were even a few years ago, that this is a huge issue, and it's now overtaken even cancer as a concern around the world. So from that, we also, thinking about the points about different countries, we have 55% around the world saying that they're thinking about their own mental well-being very or fairly often. And it's one of those topics where, again, the differences perhaps are more around age than they are when we look by country. And certainly, if we look at the under 35s, they're almost twice as likely to say that they're thinking about their own mental health very often. And we share this slide as an entree really to some of the things we're going to talk about later, because how people live their lives, what they're willing to talk about, how they feel, I think it is very instructive. And this was one where we're, even from a top line view of the data, finding some interesting differences when we look by age. Let's just spend one more moment thinking about age before I introduce our next speaker, because we wanted to have a quick look at the over 50s in our introductory comments. Now, the share of the population aged over 50 is now extremely high in a number of countries: Japan, Germany, Spain, Italy, which we're going to look at in a moment, nearly 50%. India, as we'll hear about also in a moment, rather lower. And what we wanted to have a look at was how different players in different countries are seen to be treating older and younger people. So we asked people to tell us, let's have a think about different groups in our country: advertisers, brands, employers, government, the media, the people at large. Tell us whether you think they value people aged under 50 more or less than people aged over 50. And we get a very strong sense from the public around the world that people in my country, or generally, we're finding employers, brands, advertisers, media are seen to value people aged under 50 more than they do over 50. The ratios 5 to 1, 4 to 1, 3 to 1 vary a little bit, but it's a fairly strong picture in terms of people's sense that it's perhaps the younger people who may be given more attention. Now, whether that's a problem or not, if you're an advertiser, is open to question, but it's something just for us all perhaps to think about. And in thinking about our generations, we of course can analyze the results by generations. And one of the interesting things from this question is that the Generation Z or Generation Z, depending on which part of the world you're in, are also having a sense that in many cases it's the under 50s who are valued more than the over 50s. Look at the figures there for advertisers, for example. But, and I don't know how big a but to make it, so maybe my warning sign is an exaggeration, but I do flag it because if you look at how Generation Z, Generation Z think about their governments, they are by no means sharing that sense that the governments value people aged under 50 more than those aged over 50. So some things to think about there, which we're going to be covering later in the webinar. Now, I'm very conscious that all I'm doing here is sharing some top-line findings with you. And what we wanted to do today was to look at this topic in a bit more detail. I'm really pleased that Darryl Bricker is able to join us. He's done so much research in recent years looking at demographic change, looking at perspectives from different generations, and he's going to help us think a little bit about generations, I think, from some slightly different angles. Darryl, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for that introduction, Simon, and thank you everybody for taking the time to join us today. If we can go to the next slide, please. So this slide should be very familiar to you all. There's some version of this that you've seen somewhere before. It's the layout basically of the generations mostly following the end of the Second World War, although we do have the silent generation, which goes slightly before that. But depending on how you what source you look at for generations, they basically follow in these bands. This one's from the Pew Foundation. I think it's generally seen as a pretty good source. But if we go to the next slide, academics are now musing over whether or not the idea of generations or a concept of generations is really a valid one when we start looking at the public. This one says, generations we hardly knew ye, an obituary. And basically what the position of these academics is that there tends to be as many differences within generations as there is between them. So they really question the value of even looking at the population in terms of ages and trying to group them based on generations. Next slide. I personally would submit to you for consideration that there's probably a happy medium here. It's a somewhat helpful nominal concept with plenty of fuzziness at the borders. That's the way I would describe generations. It's a data reduction technique. Next. But it's more than just simple groupings. Anybody who does research knows that age matters. Older people tend to feel differently than younger people about the products and services they buy, but also in my particular area of activity in public affairs, where we look a lot at political behavior, we know that older voters and younger voters tend to have different opinions. Now, these opinions aren't exclusive to those groups, but there is a tendency to lean one way or the other depending on age. So it is a useful concept. And while we appreciate these group differences, you shouldn't become fixated on them. And most important in this, I think, is the point that the rules tend to matter more than the exceptions. So I hear a lot of talk, for example, about the people who are baby boomers or older baby boomers all of a sudden, taking up something new that you would normally associate with a younger person, or young fogies, young people who think like old people. And we get very fixated on these exceptions, but the rules in general tend to be more important. Older people tend to be more likely to save than they are to spend. Younger people tend to be the opposite on that scale. Younger people tend to be more experimental than older people. Younger people tend to disproportionately vote left as opposed to right, which we're going to see in a presentation that's going to be coming along from Kiara. So there are some tendencies. It's important not to get focused on the exceptions because we really make a lot of them. Ultimately, looking at age has a practical necessity. It's essential for targeting. If we need to reduce the data down to something to take a look at in order to target a specific set of messages, because we know the age groups tend to consume different types of media, like I said, not exclusively, but the tendency is that they tend to consume specific types of media that are somewhat different, then it's essential for anybody who's delivering a marketing message whether it's in the world of commercial activity or whether it's in the world of the public sector or politics. Next. Most important though, and I think there is one really big exception and real pushback that we have to make on generations, unfortunately not made by the authors that I pointed to, is that popular definitions are not universal. Where you live, the structure of your home population, what you've lived through in your local context matters a lot when you're considering generations. Different generations in different countries have gone through very different types of experiences, and they're living within the context of different types of population structures. Next, please. In many countries right now, as many as 60, we're in the process of flipping the pyramid. Now, many of you are probably familiar with the concept of the age pyramid, where we show at the bottom of the pyramid a lot of young people being born, and as you go up through the pyramid, as the population ages, people fall off the pyramid, because we all eventually fall off the pyramid. But what I'm talking about here is the pyramid flipping, and this is because of the changing age structure, particularly in more developed markets, that is really putting far fewer people at the bottom and a lot more people at the top of the pyramid. And I'm going to show you an example of that in just a second, which is what I'm going to show you right now. Here's Italy. This is a population pyramid that's in the process of flipping. As you can see, the bottom of the pyramid is actually the top of the pyramid. More people, older people in the population than there are younger people. And why is that? Well, it's because the median age in Italy today is almost 48. That means half the population is older and half the population is younger. Italians are living a lot longer than they used to. The average Italian now lives to the age of 82. Back in the 1920s and 30s, they probably would have been lucky to make it to their 60s. This has led to a situation in which 65% of the population of Italy is, 24% of the population of Italy is 65 years of age or older. 1 in 4. The fertility rate has collapsed. It's down to 1.3. To simply replace the population that dies every year in any particular country, you need a fertility rate of at least 2.1. That's 1 for you, 1 for your partner, and a little bit extra for those who won't or can't have kids. Italy is almost a child short to replace its population, which is why Italy loses about 50,000 people a year from their population. They reached their peak fertility, which wasn't actually that high, at about 2.65 in 1964. So this has been going on for a while, and they dropped below replacement rate fertility in 1976. So if that's what Italy looks like, what does India look like? This is the India population. By the way, this looked like the US population, the Canadian population, the British population, the French population after the end of the Second World War. As we moved into 1960, most of them had a population pyramid that looked like this. But as opposed to having a median age of 47, the median age of India today is 29. Only living to the age of 70 on average, but that's still way more than they used to live. But it results in a situation in which only 6.8% of the population is 65 years of age or older. The fertility rate in India is now 2. It's dropped below replacement rate as well. Just happened in 2020, but it reached peak fertility back in 1965, around the same time as Italy did, but the number was twice as high in terms of the number of kids that they were having, which is why you see this population that is much more youthful. It's going to go through the same sort of process that Italy is going to go through, but much slower than Italy is going through it right now. So this is how the global population is shaking out. And that's why looking at generations in the context of what's happening in a specific country is so important. It's one big exception that I think too many people ignore. Back to you, Simon.
Well, thank you, Daryl, for taking us through this this analysis. And it's so striking. I mean, the population pyramids thing. I mean, I remember when I was taught at school in a British secondary school in the 1980s. These are completely different to what we were looking at then. The things have moved on, and to see those so starkly, I think, is really profound and gives us great food for thought. Now, as you mentioned, we're going to go to Italy and India in a moment, but perhaps we shouldn't leave this first conversation about perhaps thinking about China. What can you tell us about what's happening there?
I would think that there could be a pretty strong debate at this moment that India is now past China in terms of being the world's largest population. I think that people who study this more closely would probably be pretty comfortable with that statement. The reason for that is because the Chinese population, the fertility rate in China now is only 1.2. The most common type of household with children is a household with one. The idea of a cousin in China is almost evaporating. That you would actually have cousins is almost evaporating. And their population is the largest aging population in the world. In fact, the median age of China today is 39. The United States is only 38. This century, China is going to probably lose about half the people that would call themselves Chinese. So it's going through an incredibly rapid change, incredibly profound change, and it's going to have all sorts of implications that very few people are talking about. But anybody who's thinking about future planning really needs to be thinking about how these changing population patterns are going to affect everything.
Yeah, thank you. Point well noted, and reminder that getting to really think about each country, each market, each context, so critical. So Darryl, thank you for that for now. I should mention, if you have any questions for the speakers as we go through, please pop them in the chat box, and we're allocating a little bit of time at the end just to have a little bit of a discussion, and if we don't have time, we will we'll reply to them after the webinar. But as Darryl said, India is now poised to become the world's most populous country. Ashwini, thank you for joining us today. You're going to share the story about a new generation in India and helping us to really understand the dynamics there. Thank you for being with us.
So thank you, Simon and Darryl, for taking us and giving us your perspective on India per se. It's very interesting stuff that you've laid out. So India has seen great strides in the last few years, and India the Gen Z lives in is very different from the ones that their parents lived in. We've had a period of great political stability in the last 7 years with a strong political leadership. There has been a tech boom, and India is now just behind US and China when it comes to the startup ecosystem. We've had a period of very strong economic growth, close to about 10%. And in fact, some of the data which was shown earlier also seems to suggest that inflation hasn't impacted us as badly as some of the Western economies. Given these facts, there's a huge lot of commonality that we see within the Gen Z itself. And I wanted to take you through some of these common points. The first is that tech literacy is something which binds the youth. India is a mobile first market. Most of the youngsters are obviously on their smartphones and spend a fair bit of time on their smartphones. Data is extremely cheap in India, so probably for about $1 or so you get 5 GB of data free. Smartphones are cheap, so for as much as USD $50 you could get a fairly good quality of phone available to you. What we've also seen is that a lot of global players are present in India, and a lot of global apps are there. They've all had to customize their apps for the India situation. We know that voice search is like really big in India, and in fact we've seen a big surge in voice search usage over the last 1 year. It's grown by about 270% or so. And Google, having kept this in mind, has also come up with very unique voice enabled offerings for the Indian population. Now, while there are these global apps, like I was talking about earlier, the Indian ecosystem when it comes to apps per se is pretty strong, and these are some of the strong apps which are there in India. So while we have Google and Facebook and all the other apps which are there, there are also strong apps such as Flipkart, Meesho, Zomato, and all which are giving Amazon a run for their money. We have phone pay, which is again surpassed what Google Pay and Amazon Pay is actually doing for us. TikTok is banned in India, but you have Indian lookalikes which are there, which is Moji, and then we also have MX Takatak, which are big players in India. And hence there is a lot which is happening when it comes to the Indian app ecosystem itself. There's a strong need for self-identity. And in fact, this revolution is quite prominent, whether you look at, small town India or you look at big town. In fact, interestingly, what we see is that, the surge for and the need for self-identity is much more pronounced and strong in small town India. That's primarily because of the gender discrimination which happens over there. The boy child is still preferred in small town India. the kind of opportunities that they have, the kind of access to money, the kind of access to career choices which are available to boys are much more than what the girls are offered. But despite all these shortcomings, girls have made a tremendous stride in India. You can see some of the data which is projected over here in terms of the gross enrollment ratio in education, which has gone up significantly from 2015. uh, Women have entered into typically male dominated industries. So if it means becoming pilots or entering the army or even becoming cab drivers, for that aspect, these are industries which women have entered into. Sports is another field where Indian sports stars have seen a huge lot of success, whether it's hockey, it's cricket, or it's wrestling, or even weightlifting for that matter. And even when it comes to the corporate world, there are number of women CEOs who are there today. I think one important thing that we'll need to keep in mind when we are talking to the youth and specifically to the women in India is that the definition of self identity is not the same when it comes to small town or large town India. In the small town, it could be something as simple as having the freedom to stay out late in the night or freedom to decide on what kind of clothes that they want to wear. Versus in the large town India, it could be freedom when it comes to career choices. It could be freedom in terms of being able to decide when they want to marry and who they want to marry. Indian youth, while they're socially conscious, they're not activists. So we see that the consciousness is there when it comes to certain issues such as, climate change or sustainability. But people are giving a lot more lip service to these issues, are not actively involved in it. In fact, even when you look at politics, some of this data basis, one of the studies that we had done shows that 1 in 2 are not politically aware or inclined. In fact, 60% of the youngsters did not vote in the recent elections itself. And the intention to join politics is also not there amongst the youth per se. The only issue I would think where youth have a prominent voice and an interest is when it comes to gender issues and specifically around violence towards women per se. This is one interesting fact which I think is probably unique to India, and not you would not see much of this in the Western world, that Indian youth feel it's okay to conform. So interestingly, some facts about the Indian youth is that most youth continue to stay with their parents even when they start working, or for that matter, even once they get married. And the only reason to step out of the out of the parents' home is in case the space isn't enough, or they need to move out of the city for jobs or career-related opportunities which are there. Arranged marriages are still very common in India. So boys and girls are open to having boyfriends and girlfriends, but when it comes to marriage, they're quite okay with, getting married to a person that their parents have selected for them. Government jobs are still aspirational, primarily because of the kind of stature, the kind of, status and respectability that government jobs actually offer. And hence, conformism is not something that people look down on, and it's something which is seen to be part and parcel of their lives. Bharat, which is the small town India, is no longer considered to be less of an equal as compared to their urban counterparts. Now, this is a change which has happened in the last 5 odd years or so, because the number of opportunities that small town India itself provides is immense now. So if you look at some of the large tech players now, given that growth has sort of plateaued in the bigger towns, they've started focusing a lot more on the tier two and the rural kind of population which is there. These the three people that you see on this slide. These are all they're all from small town. The one on top is a famous Indian movie star, and the other two are startup founders of and who've attained unicorn status. So, like I said, opportunities are tremendous. In fact, some of the tier two kind of cities are now considered to be billionaire mills. Luxury car sales are actually doing rather well in the smaller cities, and hence people in the smaller towns don't see a real reason to want to migrate to the larger cities per se. Finally, is everything hunky-dory for the young Indians? No, not really. So when you look at the smaller towns, the smaller town youth feel that that they're somewhat lost for the right direction. While they have high aspirations and a lot of dreams, the route or the way to actually arrive and to conquer these dreams is not something which is clear to everybody. People in smaller towns start working at a young age in the need to actually support their families or also to make this pocket money on the side to fulfill their individual aspirations. And as a result, when it comes to career choices, they're a little lost, and they are desperately seeking guidance when it comes to the kind of future that lies ahead of them. Often young India has a jugaad kind of a mindset where they keep several options ready amongst for themselves and then decide if one works out, well and good, otherwise fall back on option 2 and 3. And these options could be as diverse as, becoming a YouTube influencer to wanting a government job to starting their own business. Overall, as you would have seen so far, while there is a cohesive picture which is there are also lots of points of differences basis gender, basis the town classes, and basis the affluence level of the youngsters per se. I just wanted to end by saying that India is ready for a youth quake. The youth in India is actually demanding. They're demanding more opportunities. They're demanding change, and they're demanding guidance from marketers who can enter and speak to them. Yes, Simon. So over to you.
Well, thank you so much for your perspectives and for sharing that sense of a new generation born in India. And as you did so, I think one of the things that was coming through is kind of as we build our toolkit of how to think about generations, you're reminding us about the role of education and what that plays in terms of change and people's own experiences and expectations, by the way, and also the small town, bigger town context, which of course will differ from country to country, but really interesting perspectives there, including of the tier 2 cities. So thank you for that. One thought I had, it felt like there were two elements here for this new generation, kind of the tech realities, and you mentioned all of the apps, but you also mentioned the cultural traditions as well as being critical if we're to build a good understanding.
Yeah.
Is that a fair sort of assessment, or are there any other things I should be thinking about?
Absolutely. So that's a bit of a dichotomy, that on one hand there is so much of advancement which has happened when it comes to technology and things like that. On the other hand, Indians are collectivist by nature. So life revolves around the family. Family's acceptance, family's respect is extremely important for the youth. So the youth is not about just rebelling and standing against whatever is happening, but it's also about following their parental wishes. So it's about having an identity within the collective society or the collective culture that India is so known for.
Thank you. Well, great insights, great guidance. Thank you so much, Ashwini. We'll talk to you a little bit later on as well. But that theme of family is going to come up again as we go to Italy. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Chiara, who has one of the most dramatic PowerPoint slides to begin a presentation that I've seen recently. Chiara, are Italians doomed? Thank you for being with us. And you're on mute, sorry.
Here I am. Thank you, Simon, and thank you to Daryl for introducing this. And yes, I know I have chosen a very gloomy kind of title. However, this, of course, as you can see also from the picture I've selected, there's no youthquake in Italy, much the opposite, I would say. But why this question? Because going back to the pyramids, what we see here is a journey over time. When we started as a pyramid when Italy was born, and we were still more or less like a pyramid when I was born, but then the pyramid that Daryl showed us is not more anything like a pyramid. And there's something more, because we're changing shape, but we're losing population. So what kind of shape will we be in 50 years? So whatever the shape, actually it looks like not a sustainable kind of scenario. And so we are doomed unless we do something, because we're seeing the shrinking population. We're looking at a minority of young people. You see here the ratio, Darren mentioned 24% over 65. You, Simon, said that people over 50 are almost 1/2 of the Italian population. Look at the very small minority, which is the Gen Z or Gen Z, as we want to name it. So what are the solutions? We've been talking about immigration for a long time as a solution, but as you can see here, over time, immigrant women tend to conform to the same kind of lifestyle as local women. And so we are not getting all that beneficiary effect from immigration. What we need to not to be doomed is to answer via reforms and policies which help youth grow back and which help Italy to flip the pyramid back. So social justice kind of reforms, housing reforms, and some kind of support for the employment of youth. Because what does it look like to be young in an aging country like Italy? You see it here. When we talk with Gen Z and we ask them to describe what the scenario looks like, you see what the keywords are: unfair situation, a struggle for opportunity, and unequal society. And this is not perception, this is reality. If you look at the unemployment rate within young people, if you compare it with the total labor force. So the scenario is gloomy. However, what we can count on, despite the general opinion that employers value more people under 50 and that our kids are not engaged enough, they give us back a very nice picture. So this pragmatism they used to look to their life is tempered by a lot of self-confidence. They believe they are the real asset of our country. They're pretty happy, and more than 1/2 of them look ahead with some optimism. And we've seen this in the polls. We've been recently being called to vote for the parliamentary election, and we got a surprise from these young voters. More than 3 million of them were at their first vote. So a surprising turnout rate, higher than the total turnout, higher than the turnout of their grandparents, which were promised early retirement, free dentures, and lots of other kind of fantastic promises by the established parties in the Italian scenario. And also a surprise we got by the results in the polls. So very interesting is that our young voters decided to value the programs of progressist and green parties, which resonated more than, and you see it in the figures, that what the established and maybe more conservative parties were talking about in their programs. So young voters valued environment, pacifism, social justice, which was clear in the program of progressist and green parties. So a good and nice surprise, maybe a bit of myth busting, in that we think of our young people not only as a minority, but as a kind of subdued, cynical, disengaged minority. So to conclude, what should we take into consideration when we look at an aging country like Italy? We should look at some changes. Here are three examples. One is the structures of families. We are moving away from what you see in this picture, the traditional Italian large family, to a lot of single person households. It is true that most of these single person households are older people, but it's a reality. And this is combined with a decrease of traditional households. And when I say traditional, I mean couples with kids. And also habits are changing. And talking about Gen Z, we know that in terms of mobility, young people do not feel they need, for example, a driving license as soon as they are of age. Not they are interested in owning a car. They have a lot of alternatives out there, especially in big metropolitan areas, with light mobility solutions or shared mobility solutions. And then we talked about employment being one of the big issues for this generation. But here again, there's some changes showing up in our Italian scenario. Gen Z are kind of putting an end to the one job for life situation, which people like me are used to, spending 20 years or 30 years within the same organization. By the age of 30, the Gen Z workers will have changed 4 to 5 jobs in our market. So they are more courageous, more curious. They challenge companies, they challenge company values, because they value transparency, they value flexibility out as soon as these values do not resonate with them. So over to you, Simon. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Chiara, for bringing us that story underlying Daryl's pyramid to life for us. And again, as we build our toolkit, I mean, two things I took away was your reminder that we need to be a bit challenging. It might be an easy generalization to say immigration will change the birth rate, or indeed challenging this sense that the young people are disengaged and don't vote and aren't bothered. One question I suppose I had when I first saw your slide at the beginning was is Italy doomed? I thought, is this one area where we might see generational conflict? But then as I went through your story, it felt maybe it was a bit more nuanced than that, because you started to talk about family and people staying at home. It feels that that might be a bit too much of a generalization as well at this stage.
Yeah, I agree. As things stand now, I would not foresee a specific generation conflict. One of the main reasons is because young people stay at home a lot, and more than their European peers. So 40% of youth under 30, I think, are still living with their parents. So no conflict when there's someone paying for you. So I wouldn't say conflict is just round the corner unless things change. And I would say conflict actually might be good for us. A sign of, you know, things changing.
Okay, well, no, thank you. That's very, exactly. That's very, very interesting. And actually, from conflict to, if not conflict, a question about maybe tensions came through. Particularly for Daryl, I had a question, and the question asker from one of our colleagues on the call knows this might be a provocative question. So I think I'm going to ask you, and then I might ask you to chip in as well, Kiara. Daryl, should we be worried about populations falling? Maybe it could be a good thing. Countries with small populations, we often see them growing quite nicely. So, what do you think to that?
Well, I think anything that you wanted to look at relative to the environment. So if you're really concerned about climate change, if you're really concerned about environmental degradation, you know, the health of our oceans, or you know, the health of our natural environment, you'd probably be looking at this and saying this is great, and you would be right. But when anything that you look at that relates to the economy, this is going to be a big challenge. Because if you look at the time period since the end of the Second World War, but even you can go back further into the first and second industrial revolutions, our economies of economic growth has been driven by consumption. And the truth is that not only is our population going to get smaller, so it's going to peak mid-century and then start to decline, what is left is going to be much older than what existed before. And older people tend not to be as engaged with consumption as younger people. They tend to, I don't want to use the word hoarder, but I can't think of a better word, but they tend to be saving, they tend to be holding on to what they have rather than building what they have. So if you're concerned about the future of the economy and you look at what's happening with our population, you are right to be concerned. We're going to have a very difficult time on consumption. I think that, you know, there's a real preoccupation when people look at population statistics about things like, for example, the labor force and whether or not we're going to have enough people available to work. Those issues are relatively easy to solve in comparison to the consumption problem, because robots don't buy new cars. You know, they don't buy homes. They don't do the things that normally drive our economy. So the consumption part of this is going to be a big challenge.
Okay, I'll just pick up on that one. Thank you for that, Daryl, because of course we have Kiara with us, where you are, I'm afraid to say, ahead of everybody, or many countries. What's the level of debate in Italy about this topic? I mean, is this being discussed in the boardroom or in governments, this question of the declining population?
Well, it's been in the background for a long time, and there are perspectives taken over time. So, for example, in this recent election, we saw fertility being discussed a lot, in the sense of that kind of worry about being doomed as a population, the Italians, you know. So it's in the debate more about how do we defend the country, how do we, and I think there's something in the air around having a specific ministry of family and, I would say, fertility. I don't think it will be that the name, but you know, tackling this specific kind of perspective around the demographic issue, which is actually much wider than only fertility. Of course, we need more kids to flip the pyramid back on its feet, as Darrell was showing us. But yeah, and the other thing is, we're talking a lot about this as a general issue, but we need reforms, and we've been waiting for reforms for maybe 20 years. So maybe it's the time now to see something. And finally, one thing I must say, even if reforms are enforced, we will need 15 to 20 years to see the effect of that. So let's not wait to see some kind of miracle happening in a couple of years or 5 years. because I know we have Darren, who's an expert here and can tell us more about, cycles.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, to pick up on your point about not the kids, the younger people. One question we had for Ashwini actually was, Chiara, you talked about how perhaps some people have been surprised by the level of interest and turnout in let's say the recent Italian elections. Ashwini, one of our colleagues on the call, was perhaps surprised at the point you mentioned that many younger people perhaps aren't as engaged in politics as some might expect them to be. And the questioner wanted to know was whether there any difference in terms of interest or activism according to people's level of activism or social class.
Yeah, so Simon, in the urban areas and especially amongst the affluent class, politics is not a prestigious profession to be in.
Right.
And hence a lot of youngsters don't necessarily want to join. But we've
Yeah.
seen at the grassroots level, there is a lot, comparatively more interest. And in fact, a lot of our leading political parties are trying to get more and more youth to join forces with them. And they have a special wing for called the youth wing, for which they're trying to enroll people. And there is comparatively more interest at the grassroots level to take part in politics or be more involved in political issues per se.
Okay, that's and in terms of the older people in India, let's say the people who, as Darryl showed, it was there's still very significant numbers of people now sort of in their 40s and 50s. What's happening in the workplace? One of our colleagues on the call is interested in how you can sustain an aging workforce. And I might just start with you and then come to Chiara on that one, because I mean, what's it like for the older employees in India these days? Are they being encouraged to stay on, or what's the environment there?
I mean, I think some of the figures that were shown are reflective of what's happening in India. That the older, the 50 plus, do seem to feel that the world is favoring the younger population, and hence there's being sidelined a little bit. But so far, I mean, our government people are in the government. They work till the age of 60. So a lot of corporates also, I mean, people do continue to work even post retirement as consultants and so on. So I think, I mean, the older generation is happy to just chug along so far. So we don't really see an issue when it comes to having, employment opportunities for the older population as such.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Well, thank you for that. We'll quickly do a comparative analysis with Chiara, because I'm not an economist, Chiara, but it might be that I might suggest that maybe if Italy can keep older people in the workforce that a bit longer, maybe that will help. What's the debate in Italy at the moment on these points?
Yeah, we're actually encouraged to stay on, and so you will see me for another 5 to 8 years. Yes. Just because at this time the system is not sustainable. So if we all leave, who's going to pay for our retirement? So that's one of the big questions, and it's one of the big political issues. It's been this kind of issue for a long time. Every government, and we've had like 16 government in I don't know 20 years have sort of cooked the recipe, but it doesn't seem to work as yet. So we're encouraged to stay. We have two problems. We're not making room for the young people, and we get obsolete in our expertise in the way we work. So we would at least need some kind of training to get ahead of the changes in the workplace, which is not happening. So quite a complex situation over here.
Yeah, well, I can empathise, Chiara, because I've been struggling to follow the questions on WhatsApp while speaking to you guys on my computer, and I'm not sure I'm world beating at this stage. But I do know we have time for one final question, and I'm going to ask Daryl just to take that before we finish. So, Daryl, just to come back, if you could give us perhaps one piece of advice, as we all in our different countries, we're in 64 countries, by the way, today in our session. What's the one piece of advice you'd give us to make sure that we think about this topic of generations in a good way?
Well, I think the biggest piece of advice I could give to anybody is just to look. Like, all of these data that we've been talking about today are all out there. They're all available. Anything on population, I mean, we're doing a really good job of measuring it worldwide now. But take a look. I mean, sit down and ask yourself the question, is this country an old population? Is it a young population? What is the structure of the population? Where is it living? Where are the trends going in terms of the population? It will tell you an awful lot about what's going to define the marketplace reality in that country. Attitudes and values and views and opinions are all things that can change really quickly based on circumstances. But the demography of a country does not change as quickly. And the thing about demography is that the decisions on all of these questions have mostly already been made. They were made by your grandparents, they were made by your parents, they've now been made by you, and they're now being made by your kids. So these things are projectable into the future. You can see what they are today, and you can simply plot out where those populations are going to be headed. It's like watching, as I tell clients, it's like watching an iceberg, transform itself as it goes through the water. I mean, it's not a surprise that these things are happening. So my biggest piece of advice would be just to look.
Thank you, Daryl. Very, very, very wise advice. And as we look towards the future, I hope you will join us on the next webinar, which will be on the 17th of November, when we're going to be looking at the retail environment, the environment of convergent commerce. Among the questions is the traditional retail outlet, the shop that we've all grown up with, the mall that we've all grown up with. Is that on its way out, or does it have a rosy future? So we'll be looking at that next time. But for now, the resources will be available for you to download and have a look at your leisure. Thank you for being with us. Thank you to our great speakers for joining us. And I wish you a very good rest of day, and we'll see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks.